You're listening to another ambitious entrepreneurnetwork.com podcast, the voice for entrepreneurs and small business. Now, onto the show.
Welcome to Industry Thought Leader Podcast. Stand out, be heard, influence. Want to influence real change with your message while become known as an authority in your field? Industry Thought Leader Podcast will show you how. Now, over to your host, Anne-Marie Cross.
Welcome to another episode of Industry Thought Leader Podcast, brought to you by Industry Thought Leader Academy. Stand out, be heard, and influence. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Cross, also known as a podcasting queen. Now, my guest today says everyone's telling us to pivot right now. How do we really do that without knowing our customers? Well, stick around because today's guest is going to show us how. So joining me on today's show is Sarah Weise. Sarah is the CEO of an award-winning market research firm, Bixa, and best-selling author of the book In-staBrain. For 15 years, she has guided companies from hungry startups right through to tech giants like Google capture attention, grow leads, boost sales, and get their message out into the world, all by getting to know their customers. Now, on today's show, Sarah's going to share how we can pivot fast by getting to know our customer with rapid market research, how we can empathize with our customer during a crisis. Shifting our message is something we need to do, as well as shift your in-person virtual research virtually and get the results that are just as good. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me.
You are so very welcome. I mean, today's topic is just so relevant. I know when we first booked the call, it was earlier on in the year, but as we've gone on, we were hoping that we wouldn't be in this situation. But now, parts of Europe and other countries are certainly going into a second lockdown. So very, very important. And I know something that industries, businesses will need to be navigating through. Share, if you would, just briefly, how did you get into this industry, market research, and that? Was it something that was always of interest to you, or did your journey kind of lead you down that path?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So I actually did study marketing in school, and then I went to work I'd started a couple of companies in college, a couple startups, and then I went to work for a big consulting firm, Booz Allen Hamilton, and I was there for 13 years. And as I was there, I got to tell you, actually, it's a funny story about my first day at Booz Allen. So I get there, and I'm like, I had one prior marketing job in the past and little sports marketing company, and I get to Booz Allen, this big consulting firm, and I'm so excited to start. And they were like, "Welcome, you're our new usability expert." And I went, "Use a what?" Because this was almost 15 years ago, and I didn't know that term. I'd never even heard that term. And they're like, "Yeah, you're our new usability expert." And I was like, I'm a marketer. What? And they said, "Well, here's a book." It was Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think. And it was about usability, website usability, and online application usability, because there weren't mobile apps at the time. And they were like, "Read this book. Don't worry, it's got lots of pictures in it. You can read it. You have a client meeting at 2:00, and just remember, you know more than the client."
Good luck.
And that was my first day. And so from there, I started to dive in and learn everything I could about usability, even though I had never heard of it at all. I'd never heard of this industry. And this was before they were calling it user experience. So that term had not even
you were ahead of your time.
Come around. Yeah. And it was just a coincidence that they needed a usability expert on this project, and they had never heard of one. So they were like, "We're going to create one." And so from there, I started learning about usability, and I realized really quickly that it wasn't about whether somebody could use your site. It was whether or not they will use your site. And it was less about the tactics. I mean, that was important too, to put everything in standard places, the navigation, the organization, the hierarchy, all of that. But a lot of it was about the marketing. And so I kind of shifted back from UX research back into my marketing roots, really. And then from there, after working at Booz Allen for a very long time and on hundreds of clients, I then started my own firm, and it's a firm, and we do market research for big companies, for small companies. We're doing a ton of new market validation right now as new companies are popping up to serve new customers in new ways. So like understanding how companies are pivoting. I'm also doing a lot of research right now. We've been hired a ton during this pandemic to validate new business models of big companies too. So say an insurance company that's launching a new model for insurance or something like that.
Yeah, incredible. And we're going to dive into what are the key things that we need to be mindful of before we even start to okay, we're going to really tackle this market. It's interesting that you're saying that, for smaller companies, even right up to larger organizations as well. Are you finding that when it comes to customers, that whether you are a large organization or even just a solo entrepreneur, that a customer is a customer is a customer? So what's relevant for smaller business, it's going to be relevant for bigger business too.
Absolutely. And it's going to be relevant even if you're an organization and you're not a for-profit business. I mean, we also we do market research for like associations and societies and, PBS and American Chemical Society and like organizations whose mission is not to sell products, but to form communities or to, send out a message, things like that.
Yeah. And I think the whole community building is so powerful, and one that I don't believe as businesses, again, small, large, not-for-profits, have really tapped into. Some definitely, but now because of what's happened, share, what are some of the changes that you may have seen in consumer behavior, in customer behavior, which is our, human behavior, because of what's happening, and these shifts that organizations, no matter where they're at, what industry that they're in, need to be mindful of, because it's going to impact what they're doing with their marketing, with their outreach, whatever. What are some of the changes you've noticed?
Well, I was actually just talking to someone at Citibank yesterday, and a big commercial bank. And he was saying, look, now that everyone is working from home and they're digital, our employees have kind of lost their mojo a little bit. They are in back-to-back Zoom calls all day long. They don't want to hop on another Zoom call. They don't want to take training from learning and development anymore. Like we need to be able to spread ideas in new ways and bring up employee morale more. And so that's an interesting one, because it wasn't the external customer. It was the internal organization that they were asking us to do research for. And that it was just an interesting project. But the principles are the same, where you really have to make sure your value proposition is on point for your customers or your audience or your employees or whoever the stakeholder is. Make sure it's on point right now at this time when things are changing, when people are changing. I mean, even the way, I bet you shop for groceries differently today than you did 6 months ago. I mean, even little behavioral differences are all over the place. I mean, right now in the US, we're going through voting right now, and a lot of people have never voted by mail or are not familiar with the early voting stations. I mean, that is a huge change in behavior, and it's just definitely a shift in the way people are doing things.
Yeah. Something that you just mentioned, and I think it would beautifully segue into the first point about pivoting fast by getting to know your customers with rapid market research. What you just shared about Citibank, and was saying that because their employees are now interacting and engaging with their own team so much more online, the last thing that they want is to hop on and do online training. And I know there are some coaches and consultants whose ideal client are actually businesses who've got team too. So that's interesting. I mean, and that in itself is what you're talking about. I mean, identify what the needs are of your industry. Now, where previously you might have gone into those organizations to talk about leadership and whatever it might be, the fact that you said now they're needing content that is far different, their needs have changed. go in and possibly, as you said, your content needs to tap into that. What are some other ways that we can start doing some market research to be able to pivot fast? I mean, that in itself is brilliant, that feedback that you've got, but how do all individuals, companies get that feedback that is so valuable? What are some ways?
Well, we can certainly do interviews, and you can do them on Zoom. Although I got to tell you, we have seen a surge in no-show rates on Zoom interviews because people are so sick of hopping on Zoom. If you make the interviews on the phone, believe it or not, if people can walk around while they talk to you and don't have to have that camera on, you're getting feedback so much quicker and more effectively. If you're like, oh, I'll just call you at this time, it tends to work out better. And it's funny because we have these video cameras now and everybody's digitally savvy enough to open a Zoom call, but at the same time, they don't want to. So we're going back to phone calls, which is a funny one. But that's one way, just straight up interviews, call your customers. It is a super simple way to get quick customer feedback and understand what they're going through. And you don't even have to have a big long interview script or anything like that. I mean, just call your customers and say, hey, I just want to check in and see how we're doing.
How can I best support you?
How are you? Yeah.
So true. And how often we're trying to come up with lots of new ideas and ways, and you're saying, you know what, ring them and ask how they're going. Your clients will give you the greatest feedback. What are some other things that perhaps you have done, again, to help pivot fast? Because the whole pivot fast for some people are, well, number one, I don't really like change. And then number two, do we really need to do it fast? But change has become far more rapid. And I think in some instances, we need to recognize the need and then be willing to just adapt and adopt to be able to take advantage of that and be where our ideal clients or existing clients are now. What insights can you share around to help us to be able to pivot fast and know that we're pivoting in the right direction and not off in a direction which no one really needs?
So another way we've done this, and we're doing it increasingly mobile now, are video diary studies. So these are literally just studies where you ask somebody so for example, we did this for a leading coffee company, and we asked people, now that they're home in COVID, and they're maybe not going out to their coffee shop for coffee, like every time you make coffee in your home for 4 straight days, just turn on your cell phone and record yourself making coffee and talk us through what you're doing, where you are, why you're making coffee now. And that led to incredible insights because they found out that of the very specific audience we were interviewing, a certain percentage of them brewed coffee in their bathrooms.
Are you serious?
Why? Wow. To escape from their children. So, I mean, people are doing things that are really funny now. Like, it's not funny, but it's just they're doing things differently. People are in the house more. We're coming back to kind of this homebody economy, a more local, community-based economy. I mean, think of all like the trips that people are taking. Most of them are road trips today. It's, we're doing things very differently. We're going outside. We're exploring nature more. Why? Because it's not safe necessarily to be inside somewhere. So, it's very different. And mobile diary studies are a quick way for you to find out. And it's a scalable option where you can have hundreds of customers just pulling out their phones and doing something. And they don't have to be selfie videos either. We did this with Google News, where we said, hey, every time you check the news on your phone for a period of 4 days, just take out your phone and click screen record and record what you're doing. Show us what apps you're using and talk us through it. And we were able to get great insights about, what apps they were using when, and competitors that maybe they didn't know were such big competitors, things like that. So
I'd imagine that it really is looking at the company. They're obviously creating different communities and then going in and engaging with those communities and say, and bringing it forward as a fun activity, something that we could all do and share.
Well, and something you can pay them for too. So, hey, if you for the next 4 days, if you take out your cell phone and take a video of you every time you brew coffee, you'll get $25 at the end of that 4 days. We'll PayPal it to you. So, I mean, you can certainly monetarily incentivize people to complete the tasks.
Yeah. As you're sharing this, obviously there's a coffee company. There was was it for a news, Google News, I think that you were sharing. I know that sometimes what we do as businesses, we go, yeah, but that's a coffee company. Yeah, that's Google News. That's not relevant to me. But of course, with your background and experience in the different industries, I know that these can often apply. What do you do, just to give some insights into people when you're looking for an idea on how can we gather market research in a way that's quite innovative and using the tools, the technologies that we now have at our fingertips? What are some of the ways that you and your team come up with those creative ideas?
Oh, yeah. So once you've gathered the data, once you've gathered the data, how do you process it and see the patterns?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you come up with those ideas in the first place, I'm thinking, that is so
You know what I do? I train my team to be really intuitive thinkers. So we look at the patterns in a very quantitative way, where we are posting sticky notes on the wall or on like a Miro board or something like that, where it's, on a virtual whiteboard, we'll be posting the sticky notes, and we're looking for trends. We're looking for patterns, and we're manually grouping them or ungrouping them, and shifting around the patterns to see different trends in different ways. So, for example, we just finished a study with over probably about 550 interviews, and I got to say, they were in person again. 550 in-person interviews with thrift store shoppers. So we went around and we had our masks on, and we had our little clipboards and stood 6 feet away, and we're asking people about why they came into the different thrift stores and how they shopped, and why they were turning to secondhand stores versus anything else, and got great data on a number of different campaigns, about 10 different personas, and then a number of different possible ideas and campaigns for each one of those personas to increase foot traffic into the thrift store, this one specific brand of thrift store, but increase foot traffic and also increase basket size while they're there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another question that I have for you, because I'm putting this through the lens of people who've got different research and, proof systems, internal systems. There's some people that we know as going to analysis paralysis. So as a market research, team that just, brilliantly thought leaders in your area, what is it for you that you get to a stage to go, you know what, is that market research that we've now gained is enough for us to build a solid strategy around? How do you know when you've got enough information and not?
Yeah. And you may not need 500 interviews. I should say that. Like, this company wanted 500 interviews, but I think you can get, even, especially if you're just launching a new product or something like that, we often use kind of I call it a sandwich approach. So it's a little bit of qualitative data, a large-scale study, large-scale survey or something like that to get some quantitative data. And then on the back end, the other piece of bread in the sandwich is a little bit of qualitative data. So that might mean doing 10 interviews, like just 10. You're going to find a lot of information from 10 interviews. And then from those 10 interviews, you're going to know what questions to ask. You're going to have hypotheses about what the customers are going through. You're going to know how to write your survey, because the worst thing you could do is pay a lot of money and launch a big, large-scale survey and ask the wrong questions. Mm-hmm. So you'll figure out what questions to ask and how to ask them. And then on the back end, you're going to learn so much in that large-scale survey to see if your hypotheses scale across a larger population, that on the back end, you're going to want to dive in there, and you're going to want to say, oh, well, I wish we had asked about that. Oh, well, it's already budgeted in for your project. Like, here's another 10 interviews or 15 interviews on the back end where you can just ask like deep questions about, okay, well, tell me, I noticed that in the survey, like, a lot of people mention this. Do you experience that? Tell me about that. And a lot of the creative solutions really come out of the challenges you're hearing from your customers. I mean, it's not, it is creative in that it's a very intuitive thing. Like, hey, a lot of customers are going through this. So how are we going to solve it? And we go through like kind of a design thinking brainstorming process to do that. But at the same time, they're all based on the challenges and the pain points that your customers are having. And those pain points today are not the same pain points necessarily that they were 6 months ago. And yeah, it's a totally different ballgame now.
It is. And I think being mindful to keep an open, curious mind. I mean, so often as businesses, we can presume a certain thing, or we may, and I've had this over and over again, come forward and become, that it's really an issue. So often, even as service-based businesses, I know many of our listeners are experts, trusted authority, thought leaders. We forget where we were. So even the simplest of things that we think is simplest can have the greatest impact, and where our ideal clients are going, wow, that was so great, that we forget, you know what, we need to incorporate this. Let's talk about
that's actually what I want to pull on that thread just a little bit, if that's okay. That's one of the reasons that a lot of companies come to us and hire us, especially small companies, coaches, those kind of industry leaders, because they say, I need an independent third party to do these interviews. Like, yes, I could do them. I totally could do them. But I recognize that I have so much bias, just inherent bias about who I think my customers are, that I'd rather, and I don't even want to tell you who I think my customers are. Will you go and find out and then come back?
Yeah. Something just on that point, I remember talking to a colleague of mine who was doing something similar, for one of her clients, just doing some market research and so forth. This business, which was I think it was an accountancy, had opened their office extra hours because they wanted to be of service, because they'd recognized that this was a need, this was something that their clients wanted. In the feedback that they got was, do you like these hours, these particular hours? The day that they had chosen didn't quite fit with a larger portion of the demographic, because for the case of this example, I think it was because many of them were parents of school-age children, and they would be off at school or something like that. And so unless we're asking those questions of feedback, we might think that it's the greatest thing that we've just given our clients, but actually they value something else, or something different. We're never going to know unless we ask them. And getting a third party, I think, is great, because, and this is what she said to me, was that often your existing customers, they don't want to hurt your feelings because there's a development there, but a third party who is just completely, not part of the relationship, they would give more honest answers to you because they don't want to hurt your feelings. Do you find that?
Actually say you're not hurting my feelings. That's actually in our kind of script at the beginning. We will say something like, hey, I have been hired just to conduct these interviews. I didn't have any part in creating this product in any way, or creating this brand, or I'm not affiliated with them in any way. You will not hurt my feelings by giving your honest feedback. And we just put it out there and say it. And just because we have labeled it and said it in the beginning, since we started doing that, we get much more honest feedback.
Well, okay. Let me just, you've got a pen and paper handy. Yeah, brilliant. So empathy and empathizing with your customers during a crisis by shifting your message. That's interesting, and I would love you to share some more insights in a moment. But before you do, one of my guests today was sharing, I think it was because you're the fourth interview today, but she was saying that there's an organization that has done a study, and because of the what's going on, what normally would have taken 6 years to shift, in people having more humility, people being more empathetic to others, the shift has changed in 6 months, which would have taken them 6 years normally. So there has been complete shift in behavior and how we're expressing ourselves. And I love that you're saying you need to empathize with your customers during a crisis. Shift that message. Share some insights around this, because I know many businesses can kind of struggle with this.
Empathy is really, really critical for a researcher to have. I mean, if you don't have empathy, if you can't really connect with that customer and understand really within a few seconds what's going to touch, move, and inspire them, what good is your qualitative research? So that is really the critical piece of any market research. I mean, the large scale surveys, the data analytics, your keyword research, that's great. That's wonderful. But I would love to challenge you and say, without a context to put that in, like really, how strong is that research? How strong are those findings? So I'm a big proponent of qualitative research and using qualitative research to maybe support the other quantitative research you have. But the empathy in general is so interesting because really, it doesn't matter like if we as researchers or as business owners, if we can put ourselves in the shoes of the person and know exactly what they're going through. If we've been through it ourselves, that doesn't matter. What matters is that we know that they're frustrated and we felt frustrated before, and we can understand that and really feel that. We know that they're angry. We know that they're sad. We know that they're confused or overwhelmed or whatever the case may be. In a certain touch, in a certain point where our brand and their experience interacts, there's some emotion. And if we can pinpoint those touch points and really hone in on where those emotions are happening, like really we can create an experience that will relieve anxiety at certain key points in the buyer's journey. And like that, understanding that empathy is critical. And I actually have this interesting background where during my MBA, while I was studying in business, I took a negotiations class with a former FBI hostage negotiator, and his name is Chris Voss. He actually has he's got a book out now called Never Split the Difference. And he's on Masterclass, and you can take his courses. He's wonderful. But during this course, I went up to him and I said, I have learned so much in your course on empathizing and negotiations. Can I do independent studies with you? And he said, you know what? Yes, I would love to do some research with you. You seem like a researcher and I like that. But he says, what I really would like you to do, if you want to be really good at empathizing and negotiating, go volunteer for a suicide hotline for a year and then come back and talk to me about it. Wow. And so I did. And so for 250 listener hours, I was on the hotline volunteering and practicing that empathy for a year. And so what you learn in that type of experience is how to empathize quickly and how to establish a rapport in a high stakes environment in an instant without sharing anything personal about yourself. So a lot of times the way we as humans empathize is like, oh, you've been to that vacation spot. Oh, I've been there too. Or, oh, you did that. Oh, I did that. Oh, you have a cat. I have a cat too. Oh, you have a dog. I have a dog too. Like we compare ourselves. But what if we didn't give any information about ourselves and we made it all about them? That's really the key to empathizing in a way that really values their experience. And so when I came back to him in a year, he goes, what? You did? You went and you volunteered and you spent 250 hours talking to people on a hotline? Really? And I said, yeah, I did. And he said, okay, now we can do research together because I know you're serious. He said, I have recommended that to like dozens of people out of the course of my career. No one's ever actually done it.
Yeah. As you were saying that, what really became apparent to me was how often marketers are sharing the fact that, empathize with your customers and build rapport by also sharing your similar journey and that because they'll resonate with you. But I can almost imagine, especially now we are in an environment where people are, uncertainty has caused for some a level of anxiety and fear and so forth. So I can imagine if we're using the example that you shared where you were on that hotline, as you said, in a very, very, very difficult environment, as soon as we start to empathize in a way that we think, well, I'm going to share my side of the story. In a way, it kind of is almost like, when you share something with someone, they go, oh yeah. And then they put their attention on themselves. Mm-hmm. Kind of like, well, hang on a minute. So I can see from a potential customer's point of view, when we keep our message focused on them, they really start to feel heard, listened to. Was that the greatest finding that you had?
Yeah. I mean, people support what they create. When they feel heard in any way, like whether it's in the creation of a process or a new marketing strategy or a more new brand, they're going to become champions for your brand.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really happy byproduct of research.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just all about the company and them getting, the data they need. I mean, that's great. But if you can also do some audience engagement at the same time, I mean, how great is that?
Yeah. And you know what, something also too, I sometimes think we do as business owners, or even in communication, we stop the creative process or the flow of the conversation on their part because we do interject with something. Sometimes allow for an open-ended question and just do this. Stop talking.
That's the best. That's actually where, when you create that awkward silence, they want to fill it because it's awkward.
Won't you be the one that fills it? Keep your mouth closed.
Let them fill that silence. Yes.
Yeah.
We use a technique where we reflect what we think they're feeling, and we often reflect the wrong feeling on purpose so that they will correct us. Yeah. So we'll be like, "Oh, you were really annoyed when that happened during that experience," and they'll be like, "I wasn't annoyed. I was livid," and we'll be like, "Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Okay, let's tap into that and figure out what was really the driver behind that, or what caused that to happen."
Yeah. So insightful there. Now, the last point, but what I'm going to do, and we've got here, shift your in-person research virtually, get the results just as good. I mean, we've already identified a number of key ways. I mean, get on the phone, possibly use Zoom, but getting on the phone has been identified as being a way that people don't have to be visual on camera. Are there any other ways in that area that you want to share with us? Because if not, I'd love for you just to share. I mean, before we went live, you were talking about your book, In-staBrain, and I think you've done some incredible research on Generation Z, and that's a very new, I mean, we don't hear a lot of content that's coming out of that, so it'd be great to kind of tap into some of your findings in that way. So floor is yours. If you want to share a little bit more about techniques in doing research virtually, or we'll let you speak to us about the Generation Z.
I'll certainly speak about Generation Z, but I do want to mention something that I think we kind of missed, is that a lot of people today are using, because more and more people are online, they're using more ads, paid ads and paid ad strategies. And what's happening is that there's a lot of keyword research going on where people and brands are really wasting tens of thousands of dollars that they don't need to be wasting on paid ad trial and error. So just a few interviews to figure out the language and the vernacular, the vocabulary that your customers are using, and really what they're thinking about as they're searching for your product, that can go a long way as a start to a really successful keyword ad strategy. And really, like, I often come in and I see customers losing tens of thousands of dollars, and I'm like, you don't have to waste all that money on paid ad trial and error if we can do 10 interviews and figure out the exact words that they're saying and what's coming out of their mouth and what they're going to type into a search bar.
It's such great insight. Something that you mentioned earlier, and I'd love for you to just give some feedback on this. You mentioned around the customer journey, and were there any friction points where businesses are perhaps not identifying and therefore not including something, whatever that may be, to ensure that that doesn't become a sticking point for their ideal customer? Number one, do you think that businesses spend enough time in understanding, well, what's the customer journey? And I'd imagine that's going to be different for every organization, isn't it? Really, well, what are the different steps and thought process as our clients get to know, like, and trust us? What's the next step? So are we doing that well as businesses? Do we really track and know exactly what our customer journeys are, or do we have a way to go on identifying what that is?
Yeah, I mean, some companies are doing a great job at doing that, and some companies have never even heard of a journey map, and that's okay, because it's pretty, if you're doing qualitative research, it's pretty easy to create that journey map, even if it's just a sketch on a PowerPoint slide, really, where you're going from awareness. Okay, at what point do they become aware of our product? Okay, what are the steps that they take to become aware of the product? Okay, even before they're purchasing, if you have to make sure that you're tracking, like, just even in the awareness stage. And what about research and learning about your product and your competitors, and what kind of research are they doing? And if you can kind of plot the key steps in that process for a particular customer. I often do a journey map that's different for each persona, because usually the different personas have different journeys. But if you can create that kind of timeline, almost from awareness to like learning, research, to purchasing, and actually what drives them to make that purchase decision, and then keep going and do it for post-purchase. If you can do all of that, and really plot kind of the highs and lows of emotional, like the empathy part of it, if you can plot those highs and lows, you can really tap into and visualize and see where there's an issue. We did this for a very large call center. And when we were able to, we actually watched people. They had a very high success rate on this call center, but we were getting bad feedback from customers. So we actually watched them, went on Zoom calls, and we're like, okay, use your phone and call, put it on speaker and call the company, and we're going to watch you press 1, press 2, go through the whole call center cycle. And so many times during this study, they were hung up on in what was called a courtesy disconnect. There was nothing courteous about it once you've been waiting on hold for 15 minutes and are hung up on. And this one phone call, and that was actually considered a success on the metrics in the internal call center system, because they completed the call, which they thought in a successful way.
So there is a thing that they call a courtesy hang up.
Yeah, and it's marked as a success in the IVR system.
Analytics. Wow. On the other end of that, where you're hanging on and
you're screaming at the phone, and yeah. So I mean, even just being able to watch somebody through a process is so valuable. And you can even do longitudinal studies that do the same thing, that are even researching or talking to customers or plotting with those mobile diary studies. That's a really good one with the diary studies over, hey, are you looking for, are you going to be using buying a voice AI system for holidays this year? Okay. Are you going to be buying that? Tell me before. Now Christmas is a little bit of ways away. So tell me now, what are you researching online? What competitors are you looking at? Every time you research that over the next few months, take out your phone and tell me what you're doing. Record yourself doing that. And so by the time you get to the actual purchase phase, or even post-purchase, or the unboxing or something like that, you've got a month plus of videos where you're actually seeing the process in action, and you're able to plot it on a map. And when you have enough customers giving you that data, you're able to see very clearly where the trends are, and where people are dropping off because they see some specific element of a competitor and they're just exiting your journey.
Yeah. Or on the other hand, what would speed up?
So let's figure out what that feature is and add it to your product, or add that feature. Oh, we already have that feature. Well, let's advertise it a little bit earlier on in the process so they don't drop off. Yeah, absolutely. If you can chronologically map that. And actually, I've got a new course I'm working on for LinkedIn Learning right now on journey mapping. So that should be out in 2021. I'm filming it right now, so I think it's going to be out in 2021. So
fabulous. Fabulous. I mean, that kind of stuff.
I do have one on foundations of market research on there now. I've got one on storytelling and one on generational design. So those 3 resources are for you.
Those up, because
we didn't talk about
my mind is going, ooh, so I'm going to go and research it. But I would love to give you some time just to share a little bit about Generation Z, as you call them. We call them Z here in Australia. Share, because this is
really fancy. Generation Z. Maybe I'll start saying
what is the greatest aha when you look at that generation, maybe in comparison to say some of the others?
Oh yeah. So this is my book. You can go buy it
Hang on,
on
let me
Amazon.
yeah, there we go. We can.
Yeah, there it is. I'm trying to get it in the video. So this is In-staBrain. It is the new rules for marketing to Generation Z or Z. And what I think, if you had to boil it down to one question that's different between Generation Z and every other generation out there, it is this. When older people want to learn something, anything, they ask the question, what do I want to know? And then they type it into Google or into YouTube or anywhere else, and they search for that and find it and maybe go down a rabbit hole or watch videos or read articles or anything like that. Now, with Generation Z, they ask a different question. Instead of what do I want to know, they ask, what should I want to know? And so this has really shifted how they get inspiration, because they're not just getting inspiration from the world around them anymore. They are on their phones, bored scrolling for hours and hours and hours at a time, and they are waiting for inspiration to strike. And so they're relying on the creators they follow. They're relying on the algorithms. They're relying on, related videos or related kind of topics, where any sort of news feed, let's say they're on YouTube, they're watching videos on autoplay for hours at a time. I think it's something like over 6 hours of YouTube a day is average for this generation.
Let's provide context, because some people might be thinking, what age group is generation?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up. It's from 13 to 24 years old today, or 25 today. So they're the younger generation, but they're starting to enter the workforce, and they are now on your teams. They're working with you, and they're your buyers and your sellers, and you have to really know about this group, because even if you're a B2B business, they're all around. They're going to be your buyers and your sellers and everything. So they're not just your customers. The interesting thing about this generation is that they are the largest living generation today, and they make up a ridiculous amount in buying power. I mean, and they don't even have jobs yet. A lot of them, right? They're still living in their parents' house, and they are really influencing the way a lot of companies today, and government organizations and elections and everything, because they're voting for the first time now. They are really hitting the stage hard and telling marketers, hey, stop paying attention to those millennials, because there's a new kid in town.
The millennials, the Z's are here.
Yes.
And you know what I think is obviously, I mean, I've got one that's on the cusp, obviously, of the Z and the millennial. But as you're sharing some of that behavior, absolutely, on TikTok, on YouTube videos, kind of watching the influencers. And it's often, it's one of those things you start watching alongside them. You get sucked in. You can really just see. And the bot.
You blink and it's been an hour on TikTok, and you're like, what just happened?
Exactly. But it's interesting because, when you start to look at this, I mean, it really does then, what is motivating them? What are they finding is, inspirational and things like that. And it's interesting when you start to hear that larger organizations, government and so forth, are really watching with real interest and starting to adapt as well, because, and because constant information sharing is instant now. We really haven't got the luxury of not really being out there and contributing and tapping into what really is motivating them. And I think organizations who say, well, we'll just wait, it's going to get to a stage, if not already, where if you're waiting too long, by the time you do suddenly go, you know what, I think we need to change our approach, long gone. The train will have left the station. It'll be too late to get back on. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely tracks with what we're hearing. And we've been hired by organizations to help them internally manage the multi-generational differences and do some research on, what are the gaps here? Why can my Gen Xers not get along with Gen Zs, and real questions like that on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. I think one thing that's really interesting about this generation is their attention span has shrunk so significantly. And that's just simply because they have been exposed to screens flying in front of their face since they were the time they were tiny little babies. I mean, this generation literally grew up teething on their parents' cell phones, and no other generation has been through that with such
so it's always funny. It's like, don't complain about that generation because you birthed them and you created them. And if not, it was us grandparents.
I mean, it is a lot of what they do is due to the times that they grew up in. It's due to the parenting techniques. Certainly, parenting styles massively shifted between millennials and Gen Zs. But because they've been exposed to all these screens, their brains have actually physically rewired. They're different, and they have rewired to process more information faster. So whereas millennials can process 3 screens at a time, so they can be, say, playing a video game, texting a group of friends, and maybe like having a conversation or watching a sports game or something like that at the same time, and keeping all that straight. Gen Zs can do that with 5 screens at a time. So, I mean, they are just bouncing their attention. So they call this like the multitasking generation, but really there's no such thing as multitasking. It's really just flexing their attention from one thing to another really fast and storing all of that memory in short-term memory, and being able to hold it all with an immense skill. Like it's really amazing what they can hold in their short-term memory. But because they're switching context so rapidly, they actually have a much shorter attention span on each thing. And so
that's because of the interest, because I'm a bit like that with people talking. If I'm listening to a podcast or watching a video and they talk too slow, my attention is elsewhere. So I often listen to people on double speed.
Or 3 times the speed. Yeah.
People go, what are you, my husband, what are you doing? I said, I don't know how you can understand that. But that's the case, isn't it? If they're not getting constantly stimulated, their brains just go off. I can understand that. But what's interesting, and I'd love if you've got feedback on this, that the two, the millennials and the Zs, is a bit of conflict there. I would have thought that maybe the Zs and maybe another generation. But what would be the conflict between those two? Is that become more apparent to you between the millennials
and Zs? Yeah. I think one thing that I wanted to make a point before I say, oh yeah, they've got short attention spans, I wanted to counter that before we move on to the other question with, even though they have short attention spans, they have this superpower that millennials don't have, or like older generations don't have, and they can hyper focus for just hours, days at a time, and just block out all distractions while they're focusing on something. And so they do make snap judgments. That is absolutely true, but they can focus so long if they have decided for themselves that they are interested in something.
Yeah. So that's where I think you've got to tap into, isn't it? What is that what does it need to get to for them to decide? So from an organization's point of view, what things need to be in place for them to go, you know what?
I'm interested. I'm here.
Of interest to me. And that's, I think, as an organization, even parents too.
Also, the learning thing is interesting too. So this generation, they love to learn. And it's such an amazing generation. So we did this study where we had them watch 3 hours, binge for 3 hours on Netflix, and then come back and tell us how they felt. And then they did the same thing with YouTube, where they watched 3 hours of YouTube, and then which is like an average like Tuesday night. And then, and then they told us what they felt. And when they watched the group that watched Netflix, they would say things like, I feel guilty. Like I just wasted my time. I could be doing something better with my time. It was just entertainment for entertainment's sake. Like I just kind of vegged out. But when we heard from the group after they binged on YouTube for 3 hours, not binged, I mean, that's just an average. But once they watched YouTube for 3 hours, they would come back and they'd say things like, oh, I feel good. Like I learned something. And it doesn't have to be academic at all. It could have been like how to do my nails, how to do James Charles rainbow eyes on my eyeshadow, how to beat that next level in a video game, whatever it was. They felt good about having extended their skill set in some way, or their knowledge, or learning about something.
Yeah, we've got some comments here. Just Karen goes, yes, hyper focus, which is fabulous. But Karen has asked a question here. So multi-generational is a thing, but I do query the reduction in concentration. I've got 2 adult children that have incredible focus for sustainable timeframes, are driven and certainly have high levels of adaptability. Their executive function levels astound me. Do they get frustrated with me? Hell yeah. It's good. You know what? I think sometimes, the differences can either bring us together through just appreciation of one another, isn't it? Or it can separate us. And I think as businesses, let's face it, human beings that are living on the same planet, I think if we can get to that level of being able to empathize, maybe not even have to understand, but empathize and just appreciate those differences. Because as you've identified, these Generation Zs, these Gen Zs may have shorter concentration, but if we tap into what really connects with them, we've got someone who is hyper focused and can certainly contribute to that way
and a hard worker and an entrepreneurial mindset. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for this up and coming generation, like in terms of contributing to society. I mean, they give me such great hope for our future.
Yeah. Well, I think they need to be, though. If I think of my son, he's in tech, and so he'll figure out, look at tickets, assign them, put them through the technicians, and he'll have screens going across, and there might be 140 tickets. He knows where they're at, and I'm looking at him because he's had to work from home, of course, and I'm thinking, I don't know how you do that, but he does it. Now, he can handle way more than what I know I could and others as well. He's wired that way. And, but if you have a conversation with them, it's so, it's almost like, can you just slow down? But they're wired that way to be able to handle the tasks that we may not necessarily be able to do. And I think that's something to consider. You were going to say something before I.
Oh, I don't remember. I was listening to your story.
This has been such a valuable conversation, and I know that we have only just scratched the surface. There's just so much more. Just hold up if you've got the copy of your book there. We were talking, of course, about Generation Z, Gen Z, In-staBrain. So what's just going to be the new rules for marketing to Generation Z, which is fabulous. You also connected on LinkedIn. You said you've got some courses there in LinkedIn training. What's it called again?
LinkedIn Learning. It used to be Lynda.com and then got bought by LinkedIn Learning. So I have 3 courses on LinkedIn Learning right now, and there are 3 more coming in 2021. I'm working on recording one now on qualitative research, and then journey mapping and some remote testing tools. So
fantastic.
Exactly
Sarah,
the kind of thing we've been talking about today.
Are there any other ways that people can connect with you if they've heard or just listened to today?
And you know what? For anybody listening, if you want a free chapter of In-staBrain, you can just go to bixaresearch.com/free chapter. And you can sign up and get a free chapter right there. I'll also send it, and when you sign up, you'll also get a PDF of the best market research tips for Gen Z. So you'll get that too. And so you can contact me on bixaresearch.com, of course, on LinkedIn, Instagram, all the things.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, I was going to say there are so many organisations that are being very mindful, and people are just listening in. That Gen Z, I think you were saying, are the largest generation.
Largest living generation, yes.
Living generation, which is just incredible. So there's lots of conversation over on LinkedIn too, Sarah. So I'm excited to see another comment there too. But look, even though this conversation has finished, in a moment we'll finish up the show. Please continue the conversation. I think it's brilliant that, thank you so much, Sarah, for coming on the show, sharing your expertise and doing all of this research so that we can tap into all of the wonderful knowledge and insights that you've shared today. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. And I'm glad we were finally able to connect after all the COVID craziness of reschedules and everything.
Absolutely. Well, all the best. Bye for now.